All right, guys, welcome to episode 2 of the Your Type podcast. I am ENT Please, and I'm here with my co host, Zach Explain. And the first thing we want to say is thank you if you watched episode 1, where we dispel some MBTI myths. Thank you to our 4 subscribers for giving us an early retirement. And today, in episode 2, we are going to talk about thinking. So we're going to talk about introverted thinking. We're going to talk about extroverted thinking. We're going to talk about how they're different, how you can spot them in the wild, and maybe some challenges that come from both. And a lot of our examples are going to be centered around people who lead with that function, right? So lead TE, so ENTJs, ESTJs, and lead TIs, ISTPs, and INTPs. Zach, before we dive in, anything you want to add?
I'm excited to get going. We've both spent the last few days reading into these types. Carl Jung's original book, Psychological Types. It's a dense book, so it's good to finally get out of the book and back into the world and engage with some of that extroverted thinking.
We're so hopped up on Adderall right now, just trying to work our way through this.
This is my 17th cup of coffee today.
Yeah, no, I actually had a heart attack last night from too much caffeine, but we
Just
do what
one?
we do for the people. No. Oh, one heart attack? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just one. Sorry for having a healthy heart. Okay, so we're going to kick it off with what is extroverted thinking?
I would say that extroverted thinking really focuses on how do you engage with the world in a way that's really efficient, in a way that's looking first at what is the objective data telling me. If you are driving along the road and you see a bunch of cops and a bunch of stop signs and a lot of things, your senses are going to pick up on that, right? You're going to see that, all that. But then your extroverted thinking then decides like, okay, well, you're going to do things like you're going to stop, you're going to go around. It's how we make those decisions out there in the real world in real time.
I agree. I think too a good way that you touched on a little bit to define it is it's just facts. It's generally accepted knowledge. It's the objective world, separate from the self. So an extroverted thinker, they will care about knowledge, but in a way they will let the data guide them, right? It is almost like an abandonment of the self and the beliefs that come from the self, the thoughts that come from the self. It's very much almost like subservient to reality in a logical way.
Extroverted thinking, I think, it's data first as opposed to theory first.
That's a great way to describe it. Yeah. Um, and they will let that data give them a formula, right? A formula for, in a broad sense, how to live, right? Formulas that they can apply to any aspect of their life. And in a sense, like this can seem really rigid, right? Just like a formula is very rigid. A formula has variables, and those variables have parameters. And TE from the outside can look very similar. And a TE DOM believes that adherence to the formula is correct, and it believes that non-adherence to the formula is incorrect. So, for example, all men should lift, right? That I don't know. That's an example of like a formula. Like a man needs to be strong. This is what the world has told me. Therefore, you need to lift as a man. It's a random opinion. A TE Dom wouldn't have come to that opinion by himself or herself. It would have been an opinion that was observed, like it was derived from the observations that they had, and then not adhering to that it would be almost, it's not insulting, but it would just be incorrect. Like if you don't lift as a guy, like you're wrong in this example.
I can think of a few TE leads in my life, people that are very, very much not afraid to tell you you're wrong. If they have decided that like you're in not in agreement with what they're seeing as the correct objective state of things, and usually they're right. Like their observation about the world is usually pretty spot on. Um, I think one of my favorite examples of a celebrity extroverted thinker is Gordon Ramsay. If you look at
Yeah.
personality database online, the people have typed him as an ESTJ. Gordon Ramsay really likes this strict adherence to proper cooking techniques. He gets so mad at these chefs in his shows when they do not do things perfectly. Because there's a reason why the dude is as famous as he is. He is a very meticulous chef. He really focuses so strongly on doing things right, what he sees as being right. He
Mhm.
gets results from it, but it also leads to a very structured rigidity that you can see. So it's a double-edged sword. For every benefit these functions have, there's also negative drawbacks to them as well.
Definitely. And it differs from TI in that way. I think TI can also be rigid, but in a different way. So let's jump there. What is introverted thinking? TI.
If extroverted thinking focuses on external data and purely on your data as opposed to any internal theory, TI is like the thinking that focuses on theory, and then data is important, but it's almost secondary to the theory. So introverted thinking, it's still using the same logical testing hypotheses process,
Mhm.
but it's using a subjective bend to it. It's your own personal data, your own experiences are coloring your analysis.
Mhm. Yeah, it's almost like I think you said something really insightful there about it does use facts, it uses objective truth, but it's not focused on objective truth. So like something that TI DOMs will do a lot is maybe they'll have a theory about something. And where that theory comes from doesn't necessarily come from fact. It doesn't necessarily come from outside of them. It comes from within. Um, you could say it comes from the ego, or that it comes from the unconscious, right? That's something Jung might have said. But whether it's either or, it's coming from within. Now, they might use facts to prove or disprove their theory. They might use it to craft a narrative. But the narrative comes from within. It does not come from the objective world. They use the objective world in favor of the subjective world. So, one high level way to think about this too is subservience. So, in an introverted thinker, the extroverted objective world serves the internal subjective world, right? Like the subjective, the theory, the narrative is the master, it's the one in charge. In an extroverted thinker, it's the opposite. Any personal belief is going to try to adhere to what's out there, to what's objectively real. And that's where the narratives come from. I mean, I'll give a little example of this. So I'm an introverted thinker, but a lot of times in work, I use more extroverted thinking or have an extroverted thinking style because most of my career I've been surrounded by extroverted thinkers. So, an example in my life has been I used to own and operate a driving school with a partner. And we were talking about pricing, right? And we weren't sure what to price our services. And because of how I was trained, I approached it in a very TE way. I was like, hey, man, let's make a spreadsheet of all the schools within like an hour and a half of us. Let's find all their prices. Let's write down all their prices. Let's find the average price. Let's pick a price. And then let's let the market tell us what is a good price. So if the price is if we're not getting enough demand, then the price is probably too high. If we're getting too much demand, the price is probably too low. So I was like very impartial in this situation to what the price should be. I had no opinion. I just wanted the data to tell me what the truth was. Whereas my partner, my business partner at the time, very strong introverted thinker, I think probably an INTP, and he had not looked at the objective world to come up with his prices. He had thought about it, and he had thought, this is fair because I believe that it shouldn't be expensive, right? And so that came from within. And at some points, like, that focus on the within can even ignore the outside world, right? And I'm not saying his approach was wrong or mine was right. I think generally whether one is right or wrong really depends on context. But I think that highlights like the main differences, right? One of them was getting information from the data, and the other one wasn't. And he might have used data to prove his point, but the point didn't come from the data.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there with saying that context matters, because there's situations where TE or TI or really any different function, they all can do anything, right? But there's just some situations where maybe engaging with that one might make more sense. It might be a better, an easier way to get to the desired outcome. It's interesting. I was thinking as you explained that, talking about the differences between your use of TE in the situation versus your partner's use of TI. There, you cited some examples of where you noticed his TI, right? His subjective feeling about what the price should be, painting his logical analysis of how to do the pricing. But I wonder, what ways do you feel like you go about noticing these types of functions in people? What cues are you picking up on to say, oh, this thing I'm seeing, this my boss do seems like a TE behavior. The ones you were modeling, right, from your previous bosses, what kinds of things were you looking at?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think an easy one is, which I saw in my previous bosses, which is why I kind of started working that way, is just adherence to data, right? Like my old boss, best boss I've ever had, um, he just didn't really have an opinion about anything. He was really focused on data collection, and he would let the data tell him a story, right? So he was an ENTJ, by the way, so lead TE. I would say that's one way. I think another way is how active someone is. Not active in like whether they do sports or if they're like sedentary or not, but more so active in that TE always seeks to keep going. It seeks to engage and move things forward in the physical world. Like that's what it cares about. It cares about accumulating knowledge and then putting it to use. So they always seem like these forward moving people. TI is a little more, it's almost like reductive in a way. Like you might learn something, but to engage with the process, you will step away from the objective world. Like think about someone that just like locks themselves in their room. This is an extreme example, by the way, but just think about somebody that like locks themselves in a room to write about a mental framework. And they might not even test it out in the real world. It's just an analysis of how it works. It's not active. It's taking reality and it's analyzing reality, and it's might just put it away. It's not motion. It's not a forward motion function like TE is. So I think those are two easy ways. Do you have any others that you would add yourself?
Yeah, it's interesting because with TI, I think you see a lot of in a lot of idea generation, especially when coupled with more intuitive functions like an extroverted intuition. I think TI can really create a lot. But I think something I've noticed in TI leads is that they are very good at really listening to your argument. People that tend to actually truly listen to what you're saying, and they don't necessarily have to agree with your argument, but I find them to typically be like, huh, okay, yeah, those are good points. Like they'll listen to them and actually understand the logic. It might not change their opinion.
Mm-hmm.
If it's in contrast with their subjective values, yeah, it's not going to work. But they'll at least hear it, right? I think that's something that I notice a lot in TI, especially in TI leads, the INTJs the INTPs and the ISTPs.
Yeah. No, and that's because they don't need to do anything with the conclusion, right? So it's like we
Mm-hmm.
can have a conversation about how you think things work or how I think things work, and there's no action item that I have to take from it. I can just be like, huh, that's cool. Like, I see how that would work that way. I don't agree with it, but I mean, it makes sense. I just don't agree with your base assumptions. I just think TE really cares about the answer
Mm-hmm.
because the answer is what allows you to do things, right? Like, if you need the assumption to take action. And so it will really fight you on the assumption because that's what they need. That's what they need for them to engage with the function.
And I think the reason why extroverted thinking does engage with the world so much and needs an answer is because, well, there's stakes. There's actual, it's the world. You could die. There's always danger out there engaging with the real world.
Mm-hmm.
In your head, mentally, in the introverted world, you have room to play. You have room to think about opportunities and new ideas. And for a TI user who doesn't need to have who doesn't have a direct role in the outcome, whatever the thought is, it's not going to affect them. You have room to play with the thought. You can still do your just like logical analysis, but it's without any subjective painting. It's almost like pure thinking without any sort of bend to it, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. And I mean, I think another way to tell them apart, kind of based on that a little bit, is how fact focused is it? Because, like you said, like TE bends to the will of facts. Like it really cares about facts, and the arguments that they have, the opinions that they have, will be centered around facts. TI users are a little less worried about facts. In some cases, they might even ignore them altogether because it's not about the fact, it's about the narrative. They might use facts to prove their narrative, but ultimately it's about the narrative.
They're
Um,
fitting the fact to the theory. It is
mhm.
it is theory first in introverted
Right.
thinking.
Well, and that kind of leads us to our next topic too, which is how can they be problematic, right? And I think that's an issue that a lot of TI Dom people might run into where they don't realize that they're bending facts to fit their narrative. And so they end up believing something that's not true in the physical world. And the further that they get from the physical world, the more likely they are to engage with their own theories. And it's a perpetuating circle or cycle where, worst case scenario, they become completely separate from the objective world and they start believing like really outside of the norm things that make sense, but that are untrue. So that's a danger that they can really run into if they're not careful.
Yeah. And I think thinking about it psychologically, the TI lead using those sorts of that using that emphasis on the subjective part of the analysis can lead to such an intense focus on the individual experience, just this person's own experience, right? My own personal TI, whatever is leading to my own uh, beliefs that frame my thinking. I think that can lead to a lot of maybe denial seems like a strong word, but just refusal to accept that one's own thoughts aren't correct on a situation. And I mean, psychologically, social psychology talks about theories like fundamental attribution theory, uh, which is basically just we tend to afford ourselves a lot more room for error than we do for other people. If we see someone else mess up, oh, they must be a bad person. There's something wrong with them.
Mhm.
They, but for us, it's like, well, I messed up because of these reasons, and these are my all my excuses and thoughts and reasons why. But if it's someone else, you don't afford them that. I think the TI
Mhm.
user, I mean, that's a bias that exists. Social psych and cognitive psych talk about these things that just impact us. The
Mhm.
TI user can get stuck maybe in a process where they're thinking through things, but they're just so focused on their own experience that they might forget the outside world to check in.
Yeah, and it might almost seem like egoic or
Mm-hmm.
self-obsessed, like how does everyone else not see this? Like this is the truth. And it's not necessarily egoic. Um like it does encompass like subjective thinking does include the ego, but it's more than just that. But it can become that way if it goes unchecked. I think TE and TE DOMs, it's not so much egoic as it is dogmatic, right? Where it's my way or the highway, but it's more so about how to do things, how to live, actions to take. It's less about frameworks for how to think or beliefs. Um, it's a little different there. They can find themselves in like different problems.
When I think that goes back to the example of Gordon Ramsay, there's one of the problems when extroverted thinking is so emphasized, and I think that's comes about when you really identify with those sorts of actions. You do tend to neglect other parts of the whole human experience. So if you're focused on extroverted thinking, you're going to be ignoring the opposite, which would be introverted feeling, your own analysis of your personal values.
Mhm.
This striving for order and structure and alignment in the world through TE, this dogmatic degree to the dogmatic degree that we're talking about here, if you're at that level, you're probably really suppressing those internal values. And historically, it can lead to a TE DOM really being able to make a lot of change and influence on the world, even like within fiction, for example. Um, a lot of villains tend to use TE either as a primary or secondary function. It's because it's a very good function at getting things done. Not to have, it's not that TE users are villains. Definitely not the case.
No, no.
Um, except Emperor Palpatine is INTP in my opinion. So
No, I mean,
just
I
saying.
think, yeah. No, I think it can be not bad, but like bad on a personal level the if the self gets ignored, and that is the real risk that heavy TE use runs into is completely losing the self and what it means to actually have a self as a human, which includes my own feelings, my own perspectives, my humanity, like my empathy. They really run into that risk if they push it aside, and the focus becomes very narrow, right? I think when they start incorporating other functions and they're developed, their focus widens, because not everything becomes black and white. But formulaically, TE is very black and white. It doesn't have the room for nuance that TI does. And TI has that nuance because it really cares about understanding. It doesn't care about action. Um, Whereas I think I touched on this a little earlier, but just to reiterate, TI runs into the opposite problem, losing the world to the self. So not losing the self to the objective world, but the other way around. They just run into the issue of just being detached from reality and making no sense to anybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something to consider with these functions, especially the thinking ones, is just how powerful they can be in terms of what they generate. They really do get a lot done, both internally and externally. And I think when they're in isolation, like we're talking about now, it's a very different experience to when they do get combined with those with sensation, feeling, intuitive functions, all the others, because sometimes there is a place where black and white is needed. You do need to be, it's this or that. It's life or death. That's the usual one.
Right. It
But
matters of
there's
action a lot of times, yeah.
exactly. So there's times where that's needed. Of course, that's not the only thing that's needed, which is why we have 8 functions instead of just one.
Mm-hmm.
So this function to me is really just the structure, order, um, almost like opposite of chaos kind of function. It's very much trying to keep things orderly. Maybe it doesn't always do it right, but that's its goal, is to maintain order and stability.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think they're both trying to do that. I think that's just the goal of thinking functions. It's just
Yeah. Oh
are
yeah.
you
Both.
yeah, are you doing it in the external world or in the internal world?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they both definitely like do some type of ordering as well. Great. Well, I do want to add too that this stuff is true. Like these functions um, are defined this way, but the further you get from them being in a dominant function position, the less true that this is going to be, because the because the main function, the primary function, or I guess the dominant function, is it's like the one in charge. So if you move extroverted thinking to the auxiliary or to the tertiary slot, it becomes more and more subservient, to where maybe a TI user that has tertiary TI, like they won't be as detailed because it's not the thing driving the person. It aims to serve, I don't know, maybe introverted intuition, right? So these things can just get less true as you move down the cognitive stack.
I
Sorry, go
think
ahead.
a good way of thinking of that is they're less developed. They're sloppier in their execution. They're
Yeah,
still trying to do, because I think what we've described here has been the optimal goals of these functions,
yeah,
maintaining order and generating ideas and testing them. And the further down they are out of your MBTI stack, being 4 functions as your primary ones, it's less nuanced. You're not as good at using it. That's how I tend to think of it.
I think it's both. It's less skill, less like just being less adept with a function, but it's also like it's subservient to something else. Like if you use uh, introverted
Great.
thinking as your main thing, like that logical analysis, that way of perceiving the world, that's going to be your main frame, and so you're going to be spending a bunch of time in it. But now, if you move it to the auxiliary slot and you have extroverted sensing as your first thing, or let's say extroverted intuition, like myself, your goal no longer becomes truth, it becomes novelty. And truth, like, you will seek truth within the new novel spots, the new novel hoops that you jump through, but you won't ever stay in one place long enough to fully uncover truth because that's not your lens for the world. I think there's a little bit of both, like truth in both of the things we said. And so to wrap that up, I wanted to do one last thing. That was Zach Explain's idea, which is I use introverted thinking a lot. He uses extroverted thinking a lot. And so we just wanted to sell it. Like, how would we sell it to the other person that this is like a cool thing, a useful thing? What would be your pitch? So Zach Explained, you can go ahead and sell TE to me.
So my extroverted thinking, me being an INFP, is my fourth function. It's my inferior one. So right off the bat, it is going to be my least developed function. And I find that the more that I engage with it, the more I'm like, hey, this is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
This is really effective. It is the times where, so for me, if I don't want to do something, whatever it is, maybe it's a project at work that's not interesting, extroverted thinking is the place I go to get it done, because that is where I will create a schedule. And I'm not saying this is existing solely in a vacuum. My introverted sensing definitely adds to that. But ultimately, it's a way that I can go about finishing projects in a way that makes sense, in a way that is actually efficient. Now, it's underdeveloped, so I can feel that I'm not always on the ball with it. Sometimes I'll do planning, and it just won't work out. For example, a few weeks back, I did an oil change on my fiance's car.
No,
and I did a lot of planning ahead of time, which I think was also in part due to my extroverted intuition. But I'm doing this planning and I have all this in mind, and I'm executing on the day of. I'm actually doing the oil change. It doesn't work out. Suffice to say, I had a very expensive lesson. For me, even though I did the work of the TE, I did the organization of the logical steps.
Dude, you are not selling this.
It didn't. That's the thing, though. When it works, it's great. So think of I'm more so someone who I've only been able to see it. Like my TE, my extroverted thinking, I truly believe our fourth functions are not fully. It's not something that I feel like I have a full grasp on. So I see it in bits and pieces. The parts I see are really effective.
Mm-hmm. No, and you don't, right? Because it can be partly unconscious at times, which we'll touch on in a later episode. But no, I totally agree. I mean, I think you did sell it, but you sold it in the counter way, where it's like, if you don't want to have an expensive oil change because you mess up.
I show what happens when you don't use TE properly.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's almost like getting insurance.
In a lot of ways, it can, like, we can list out your weaknesses and your strengths, right? It's like, on the weak side, it's like, you might be tardy to things a lot. You might not have things organized and things kind of seem like they're over the place. It's a little chaotic. So the counter side of that is like, things are not chaotic. Things are controlled. Things make sense. Things are orderly. And because things are that way, it's easy to move forward. It's easy to make progress, because chaos does make it harder to move forward in a lot of ways. So no, I think that was a really good presentation. I think for TI, like, I use TI a lot as my auxiliary function, and it just supports my ideas. I will honestly say, like, if you're an extroverted intuition user, TI keeps you from, like, destroying your life. Like, like, I think I have so many ideas and, like, random thoughts that if I didn't have, like, a logical filter for these things, I would be so fucked. Like I would do like the craziest shit, whether it's like a good idea or a bad idea, right? So it could be
All
very
those
dangerous,
intrusive thoughts are just getting through
dude.
filter free.
Dude, all intrusive thoughts. Um, totally. And I mean, I find that, right, because it is auxiliary. Sometimes like I can't ignore it, and I have these periods where I go too much into NE and FE, and not only do I become obsessed with external validation, I also just don't. In a lot of ways, I live in a fantasy world, right? I need. It's kind of funny to say that because TI is subjective, um, but it does ultimately, like with something like NE, it really does clean it up and makes you look at the situation a little less crazy, like with a little less crazy of goggles, um, to where you're like, okay, maybe this is not a good idea or a good thought or a good theory or whatever. Like maybe this is a little ridiculous for these
Mm-hmm.
reasons, right? I think that's one. I would say another strength that makes TI really good is like TI can be pretty unconventional because like by definition it doesn't look to convention as truth, right? Convention equaling objective reality. So you'll see a lot of innovators, a lot of maybe not necessarily business people, but like entrepreneurs that are creative in some way. They might have TI because they might take what exists. Um, they might take what exists and like kind of deconstruct it and try to do it different, try to do it better, think that they have a better theory or way of proving something than previously existed. Like ESTJs, like TE users, they can do that, but it can be kind of limited to the objective reality that they see. So if they have an insight, it's always from moving those real world pieces together. It doesn't come from within. It doesn't come from like inspiration. It doesn't come from that place that can lead you to unconventionally do something cool. Um, so I would say it's great for that too. You can really deconstruct like something I do a lot, which is probably annoying for some people, is like deconstruct every narrative that exists. Where it's like, um, I don't know, like everyone needs to get married. It's a bad example, but it's like a TE user would be like, this is accepted. This is what I should do. What's the most efficient way to do it? A TI user might be like, well, says who? Like, why is this true? Right? And they might dissect it and then build their own framework about what is true and what's not. So you'll see a lot of TI users like, and FI users as well, right? Just subjective people live their lives in a very different way. So I would say that's like a neat selling point there. I got more reasons, bro. I've engaged my NE, but I think I'll just leave it at that as to not make the episode too long.
I like that. You did make me think of one more thing about TE that I'll share.
Yeah, go for it.
I think for me, here's a quirky example of TE. It's being in a group of people in a social setting, at a table, at dinner, or at a restaurant of some sorts, and you're at a table, and it's looking to see who makes the most sense sitting next to who. Like what there's an ordering of the people at this table that will make everyone have the best possible experience.
Mm-hmm.
TE for me is a way of analyzing that and thinking like, okay, well, I know like from watching these people that these people talk a lot and then but these two don't really have anything in common. And it's making assumptions, right? It's kind of enforcing the environment to match something. So for me, it's that TE serving maybe my introverted feeling, my primary function. But the TE process still works to try and I don't want to say better the world, but organize it and maintain it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it depends too. What is it trying to optimize, right? Like, is it trying to optimize a good time. Because TE can do that. They're very good at seeing like what the best combinations of people are. Or it can be like something a little less tangible, like who should you pair with who to have like ultimate peace and outcomes, right? So that could be FE, right? But at the end of the day, it's these objective functions that are the ones that are going to be doing this. They really care about organizing in the real world. TI doesn't do that much on its own. It might go home and analyze the social situation later, but it has no desire to do it in the real world. All right, guys, thank you all for listening to episode 2. If you enjoyed it, let us know in the comments. If you didn't enjoy it, tell us why we suck in the comments. And stay tuned. I think we're going to do a lot more episodes. We're going to do extroverted intuition versus introverted intuition, extroverted feeling versus introverted feeling. We're also going to do introverted thinking versus introverted feeling, things like that, to just make it more easy to understand what you use yourself. That being said, Zach, anything else before we wrap?
Just gonna say I'm excited to keep going through the absolutely dense chapter that was psychological types, chapter 10.
Dude, I still got some stuff to read for sure.
I think this is gonna need a few rereads.
Oh yeah, to fully understand 100%. But it does also show us how, like, it showed me how poorly I understood things, and it also definitely showed me how poorly most MBTI content creators understand things as well. A lot of things get distorted. Yep. It's like playing telephone. Like, people listen to this YouTuber, that listen to this YouTuber, that listen to this TikToker, and it's like it's really far from the source. So I'm really excited that we're digging deep here. And if you're interested at getting things super close to the source without reading this dense book yourself, then you're in the right place.